This is the first in a series of reports exposing the tax-exempt foundations, such as the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, which ironically advised war as being the way to bring about peace. I mean, these are just things you can't make up, ladies and gentlemen. The following clip is a real gem. I can't believe I found it by accident, actually. It's a rare interview with Norman Dodd, who investigated the Rockefeller and the other criminal cartel tax-exempt foundations in the 1950s, and his first-hand accounts of things. The following clip is a radio broadcast from the late 1980s with Dr. Stan Monteith, who had a radio show, and it's a very revealing topic. And then we'll have Norman Dodd.
27 years ago, the Congress of the United States authorized the formation of a congressional investigating committee to try to analyze the functions of the great foundations in America, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. Mr. Norman Dodd was the director of research for the congressional committee that came to be known as the Reese Committee. Mr. Dodd is an economist. He's the consultant as far as investment is concerned. But during that period, that very important period, some 27 years ago, he headed research in the effort to find out what indeed were the great foundations doing in America. Mr. Dodd, what did you find out was the stated objective and goals of the great American foundations?
We found out, Doctor, that these foundations had as their objective the orientation of the people of this country to the idea of collectivism, and thereby nullifying for good and all the commitment of the country to individualism, which was the feature of the country at the beginning.
Now, how did they go about doing this?
Well, primarily they did it, Doctor, by securing control of what is known as the money supply of the people of this country.
You're speaking now of the money supply that was going into education.
Well, it's the money supply of the people of the country as a whole.
And how did they do this?
They did this by working out a system of banking, which was foreign in its concept, but it enabled debt to be what we call monetized, transformed into bank deposits.
Now, how did they specifically set out to influence education in America?
Well, by having at their disposal unlimited quantities of this newly created money and being able to reward the personalities who were active in the world of education, administratively as well as academically.
Were they able to influence the textbooks or the teachers?
Yes, they were. They were able to see that textbooks were almost produced on order, and assuring the publishers of textbooks of the funds necessary to make the publication of those books profitable.
Now, have you personally had contact with some of the directors of these great foundations?
Yes, I have.
Could you tell us about it?
Well, one instance, I'll use a couple of instances as illustrations. One instance had to do with my responding to an invitation from the president of the Ford Foundation, who asked me if, when I was next in New York, would I stop in their office and have a visit, which I did. And on arrival, after amenities, Mr. Gaither, who was the then president, said, "Mr. Dodd, we invited you to come and see us this morning, hoping that you would, off the record, tell us why the Congress was interested in operations of foundations such as ours." And before I could think of how I would reply to him, he volunteered the following. He said, "Mr. Dodd, those of us here at the policy-making level have all had experience either with the OSS or the European Economic Administration in operating under directives, the origin of which was the White House. We today operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know." Whereupon he said to me, "The substance of the directives under which we operate is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that we can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Well, figuratively, I nearly fell off the chair. But I did remark to him, Mr. Gaither, in the light of what you just told me, many of your grants make sense. I can understand them. But I do not think you're entitled to withhold this information from the people of this country, to whom you are beholden for your tax exemption. So why don't you tell them what you've told me? And his answer was, Mr. Dodd, we wouldn't think of doing that. So I said, well, Mr. Gaither, answer your first question. You forced the Congress of the United States to spend $150,000 to find out what you've just told me.
And so they've been pushing socialism in America ever since.
Well, then, in the light of that, of course, you see conditions develop, and of course you then can add and ascribe the development of these conditions and the events that accompany to this policy. Because it's only in the light of that policy that these events and effects make any sense. And this is how, and this is their problem, Doctor. They cannot avoid having effects result from the grants that they make. They cannot avoid it. Therefore, those of this in this country who would be concerned with what are they up to merely has to look at the effects and work back and compare the effects of a grant with the explanation of the grant in the first place. I mean, I'll just use as an instance to clarify the matter. You will remember there was a time when the Federal Reserve System was installed in this country by the Congress. In other words, it was legalized. And it had been preceded by a long period of years and a struggle to get the Federal Reserve approved. Finally, it was approved, and the argument that swung the approval in that direction was that if the system is installed, the result will be the elimination of bank failures. And inasmuch as there had been in those days a plethora of bank failures, this was held up as a very beneficial development practice, what they call fractional reserve central banking. But nobody goes back, this was in 1912, nobody goes back to 1930 when every bank in the United States was closed. Every bank. There wasn't a solvent bank in the United States. That, you see, was proof that the original purpose was in no sense to eliminate bank failures. And this discrepancy and these contrasts and these contradictions are the telltale part that those who have imposed these practices on us as a people are scared to death that it's going to be picked up and stressed and taught and so forth and so on. But it isn't.
No, and the mass media doesn't already talk about it.
No, but neither does the educational world. This is what will meet the challenge. One accredited educational institution with trustees who openly declared that we noticed this. We noticed the inconsistency, the contradictions, and we are setting forth an effort to account for them. And that, in my opinion, would explode the whole network. And they have told me that this is what they're scared to death. Somebody is going to pick up this string.
Mr. Dodd, what do you think is the basic crux of this whole problem?
Well, Doctor, I feel that the problem itself originates with that aspect of human life which condemns men collectively to experience what is known as the fall of man. And that subsequently Christ became into the world with the knowledge that the individual could confront this condition and not become victimized by it. But that entailed the individual emulating Christ, who through the temptations in the wilderness was confronted by the satanic, listened to what the satanic had to offer, and say no. And then add, and I know you to be Satan, and Satan went away. That to me is the clue to how to nullify this influence which has had humanity in its grip for centuries. Well, of course, what it means is that one has to accept the realism of the inclusion of evil, and that in turn challenges the world of education to equip the student with the knowledge necessary to recognize evil in action within the sphere of his own experiences and refuse to be part of it. Then this influence, which has been behind the creation of this network, can't operate. It cannot operate in the light. And admittedly, it says that it acknowledges that, so that it is, and those who are part of it knowingly are scared to death that somebody at some point, as they put it, is going to pick up the end of a string and little by little follow it to the end. And as they put it to me, when that happens, we're through.
Now, did you or any member of your staff ever have the opportunity of going through the records of any of the great foundations?
Well, we had one remarkable instance of that kind, by invitation. This invitation came from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and was in response to a letter which I had written to the endowment asking certain questions, seeking certain information. And this invitation was issued to me over the telephone to come to their office in New York when I was next there. This I did. And on arrival, found myself in the presence of Dr. Joseph Johnson, the president, two vice presidents, and their own counsel, a partner of Sullivan and Cromwell. And after a minute, Dr. Johnson said, "Mr. Dodd, we received your letter, and we can answer all these questions, but it will be a great deal of..." And I sent them to the warehouse. And then we concentrated on just using our funds to build this new building across the street from the United Nations, which would provide the various organizations that would follow the United Nations activities with a place to meet. But, he said, we have a counter-suggestion, and that is, Mr. Dodd, if you can spare a member of your staff for 2 weeks and send them to New York, we will provide that member with a room in the library, our library, and the minute books of this endowment since its inception. And we think whatever you want to find out, you can find out through that source. Well, my first reaction was these men had lost their mind, because I had a pretty good idea of what those minute books might show up. But as I thought about it, I realized that most of them were new in their position, and my guess was none of them had ever read the minutes themselves, which would be, of course, quite a task to cover 50 years of minutes, reading. Those minute books might show up.